Good morning. We are in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, Mika Hashem Elokeinu Hamagbihi L'Sheves. We're winding down the last 9 pages of this long discourse that we've been learning the last few months. And we are on page 425. And this is part of the foundational text of the end of Hemshech Hayim Beis. Obviously, there's a lot more material here than Hayim Beis, as far as not necessarily as far as explanation goes, but as far as topics, because Hemshech Hayim Beis never was concluded. So from this mimer, we can understand the flow, the answer to questions and ideas that the Rebbe Rasha broached or began to discuss, ask questions, and here we can see the answers and the development of these ideas. And I, throughout the learning, I keep weaving back and forth interweaving between the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, which is the basis of the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, in Torah, and the Hayim Beis. So where are we right now is a piece that is in Torah, in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, but the Rebbe Rashab never even got back to the answer of Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom, how the Nefesh Habam is transformed to oil and fuel for divine love. The Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe did explain that. They also explained Ner Mitzvah and Torah, which also the Rebbe Rashab never returned to, at least not in the full sense of the word. But the central theme, that the goal is to transform this lowest of worlds, in the language, the famous language that he brings here and that we learn all the time, making a dira b'tachtenim, and a dira to whom? To Atzmus. So even though he doesn't say these words exactly here, but in other places, and Atzmus we know is higher than tachtenim and higher than elyenim, or to use the language from this mimer, higher than Hamagbihi and higher than Hamashpili. He's higher than Aliyah and higher than Atak, like he said, higher than Emek Reim and higher than Emek Tachten, to the point that they all become like one. He's exactly the same, Atzmus, before existence and after existence, and the highest levels to the lowest levels. And yet, the kavana is that in the world of Tachtenim, where there is a Tachten, and there is an Elyon, there's a gradation, and there's a process, and there's higher and lower, in this world, in Tachtenim, and Tachtenim is, the name itself tells you that it's the lowest of all worlds, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, Tachten Shein Tachten L'mata Mimenu, that in that world, not only should we experience a measure of godliness that's commensurate to us, a godliness that relates to us, in other words, the ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, and not only the ayin of the Yesh HaMiti, but the Yesh HaMiti itself, that we should experience the Yesh Mamish, Atzmus, which is higher than all these levels. But you can't get to the higher, as I said, unless you go through the lower, meaning the lower levels of Yichud Tata and Yichud De'ilah. So what we learned yesterday, and I'm saying this also being informed about what we learned in Hayim Beis, because in Hayim Beis, this was a long arichas. The end of Hayim Beis, as we learned it, was exactly about this point, that there's the ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, the ayin of the Yesh HaMiti, and ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, and Hashem wants 2 levels of ayin. And then there's the level that we reach to, the yichud of Yichud De'ilah and Yichud Tata, which is the ultimate, which will be revealed, L'asad Lavi, or it calls Elam Haba. So if you learn the Techila, not necessarily the language, in some places Hayim Beis directly quotes the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, but in some places it doesn't quote it, but the content is there. As a matter of fact, I wanted to discuss it, but I'll discuss it later. You can see the Rebbe Rashab's style and approach is far more, I would say, beslapshus and seichel, and that's why he maybe doesn't use the exact language of the Mittler Rebbe, which is a little more abstract and a little more dense. But the themes are there. And that is that there's a higher level, a lower level, das tachten Yichud Tata. In the language of the Maimer here, Hamashpili, with divine that relates to existence. I should begin the other way around. There's the higher level, Hamagbihi, which is Hamagbihi L'Sheves, the ayin of the Yesh HaMiti, that the very fact that the divine reveals itself. And there's complete bittul. It doesn't relate to existence. As Lamaila Mishtalshul says, he puts it all together. Doesn't relate at all to existence, but it's already a level of presence, of divine presence. Then there's Hamashpili, Das Tach, Yichud Tata, Mashpil leaders b'shamayim ba'aretz. So it manifests in shamayim and aretz and does relate to existence. And then there's the level where they both become like, both are considered mamish kula chad mamish, because the Eibishter Atzmus is higher than both dasan and das tachten kel deis havaya kula chad mamish, as we learned. Nitfes ve'ena nitfes, that he manifests. The world is contained by God. Contains the world, but the world does not contain him. God defines the world, but the world does not define him, as we discussed at length. So that, in the language of Ayin Beis, was Yichud Elah, Yichud Tata, also the language of the Mittler Rebbe, and especially these two levels of Ayin. But then the goal is to reach a place that's beyond. And if you may recall, after we finished Ayin Beis, I went to Torah Shalom, Rebbe Rashab Sicha, a long Sicha on this topic of Yichud L'mayla, Yichud Mamayla Mata, Mamata L'mayla, and ultimately joining them together, because each one has a quality that the other one doesn't have. From our perspective, Yichud Elah gives us a better picture of the divine. Yichud Tata gives us a better picture from our perspective. And then there's joining them together where they become like one within from the perspective of Atzmus. So that's what we learned yesterday. We learned that there is, after we learned the middle paragraph on page 424, the next he said, so then why do we say Hamagbihi, why do we say Hamagbihi and Hamashpili? Achashu Atzmi is Baruch Mebchinas Emekrem Emektach the Beis Adeis Hanal. Now, when I read it, as I said yesterday, I was having difficulty because it sounded to me, it should have said, Shuhu Atzmi is Baruch L'mayla Mebchinas Emekrem Emektachas the Beis Adeis Hanal. Or the Shuhu Atzmi is Baruch is Miyachid Bchinas Emekrem. When he says the lashon achashu atzmis baruch mebchinas emekrem ve'emektachas, can be a little confusing. That was my thinking, but you could read it. I mean, if you understand the Havana, you could force it into these words, even though it seems to suggest what I just said. So the question then is, eich shayich lemer lashon akbal l'mayla v'ashpal l'mata machashu l'mayla k'may l'mata mamish. So the whole concept of Hamagbihi, elevating something, and Mashpili, bring it down, meaning the difference between Chozer, as we'll soon learn, elevating existence all the way to the levels that are higher than existence, and Mashpili, bringing it down, the divine within existence on the terms of existence, is not shaykh to Atzmei Yisbarach, to Atzmus. That's shaykh only below. So why does he use that language? Because the answer is, as we learned with Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, the kavanah is not that there's yichud of Hashem Elokeinu in Atzmus. The chiddush is that down below, when neshama come, not the way the neshama is ola b'machshava Techila in its root, but as the neshama comes down into a body and into an animal soul, even though he doesn't say that explicitly here, but he says it a few lines afterwards. Like he says, so she'enza metam daf nesham and begufin dafke mekayim teira mitzvos b'pel mamish b'mesiras nefesh b'av v'yir afilu b'yetzer hara. So he does say it, even with the yetzer hara, to transform darkness to light. That's what he desired in the highest levels. The zed dafka ola b'machshava v'nisava. The no's tchilasim b'seifim, because the beginning is wedged in the end, meaning dafka, the kavana is birurim of this world, the birurim of the rapach and the tzutzik dusha, like he says afterwards, the 288 sparks, the shem havaya b'teira mitzvahs as they come down below. Like we say, teira leba shamayim he. Doesn't mention that here. The Torah mitzvah is not for above, it's about transforming this world. That's why Hashem did not give the Torah to the malachim, to the angels. And for this reason, we call it Havaya L'keinu Mamish, that they join together one down below in this world. In other words, we're Mamshich, B'li Shinu Mahus Klal, of Elakush, Elamayla Mishtamas, the Emikrem, the Emiktachs, the Dasam, the Tachtan, that we're being Mamshich, that higher level that's beyond the distinction between higher and lower, that should come down mamish lamata, lamayla, malubish lamata, b'shem havai, the mitzvos, b'tshuva, b'li helen, v'levush klal. As it will be in Elam Haba, in the future, when the yesh will receive directly from the yesh hamiti, and b'dilug beis deis hanal. By leaping over. Not that we leaped over initially, but once we reach this level, it's like a connection that now we can connect etzem to etzem, yesh to yesh. Which is why, even though he doesn't say it here, but in Ayin Beis, this was a big topic. Neshama nizunis min haguf. Today, the body is sustained by the soul. La'asad love, we learned, the soul will be fed, but nourished by the body. So there's something that the yesh will add that the ayin doesn't have, because it connects straight to the esem. We'll elaborate on this more later, but just wanted to mention that briefly. And now a dogma for this, we continue learning, was in the Heichel Kedesh Kadoshim, in the Holy of Holies, in the Beis HaMikdash, Nitfas ve'ena nitfas, mokem ha'aron eina min hamida. How is that possible? That's like space and not space at once. Nitfas ve'ena nitfas. He contains the space. Hu mekeme shalelim ve'ena elam mekeme. Even though Shemayim and Shemei HaShemayim leichal kaluk, in higher levels, they cannot contain him. But down below in the Beis HaMikdash, in the Kedesh Kadoshim, you have this containment of a dogma for what will be Elam Haba permanently and all over in all of existence. So a dogma for that is in Kedesh Kadoshim. And with that he goes on, V'kach yuvan. And maybe I'm gonna learn from here, even though we learned it yesterday. I think it's kedai, it's worthwhile going back on the fourth line of page 425. So I'm going to learn it inside and go over it again. But I just want to stop if anybody wants to clarify anything from what I've based about what I just said right now.
I want to ask if it's possible to apply to our experience today. We always say la'asid lavo, but that's never going to change. We're always going to say la'asid lavo forever. So is there a way that we could say that these concepts apply to our experience, that the neshama is nizan from the guf, etc.?
Yes, there's always in Avodah, you always can find examples of these levels. I mean, just the fact that, for example, we have weekday, the Avodah that we do in the weekdays. We have the Avodah we do on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Then we have the Avodah of Yom Kippur. So right there you see three different levels of connection. In Yom Kippur itself, we know we have 5 prayers. Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chai, Yechida. So if you want an example of the highest level, it would be like Yechida. Like Ne'ilah, on the highest point of Yom Kippur, even though hypothetically a person can reach that level all the time, but there's nothing like Yom Kippur. So there's that Achas Yechida where you completely get absorbed in the Etzem. You have absolutely no sense of self, total Mesiras Nefesh. That would be an example of the highest level, an example only. And then lower levels would be Chaya or Nefesh Ruach Neshama. So it depends. If you're using your Avodah Al Pitam V'das, like B'chol Avavcha, B'chol Nafshecha, B'chol Meidecha, they also have 3 levels. B'chol Avavcha is all your heart, meaning with both sides of your heart, which is the Yetzer Hara, the Nefesh Elikis and Nefesh Habam is the Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Tev and Yetzer Hara. Just 1 second, please. 1 second. Okay. Sorry about that. Then you have a chol avavcha, so that fills your whole heart, both sides of the heart. B'chol nafshecha, we learned, is like a certain element of a feeling nateless nafshecha, for a certain level of bittul and mesiras nefesh. But still chol nafshecha is still with your whole soul. And then b'chol meidecha is completely beyond. So there you have hundreds of examples every day when we daven all the Aveda that we're constantly going from one level to the next level. So every one person has to figure out your own personal Aveda with your mashpia, how you can apply these levels that we're discussing on your terms, applying it right now. Obviously, the Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe is laying it out in the full glory to the highest levels, la'aseh lavi. But just like we say we can live Mashiach today, when you do something that's dedicated to Hashem and to God's purpose, and you reveal the aleph of godliness in Goyla, in your daily activities, in your house, in your work, in your money, in all your interactions, you're revealing a little geula in your life. So the same idea here. So Elam Haba is the full-blown version of it, when the whole world will be transformed and permanently. But that doesn't mean we cannot find some way, a me'ain, what's called a me'ain, a taste of it, an appetite, a somewhat of an experience of it. And that's the way we do our work in bringing the Geula. So the details of it, I think every person has to work out their own Aveda, but that's a general framework.
What's an example of a me'ain where the neshama is nizan from the guf?
When you help somebody physically and you do a mitzvah only physically, the neshama can't do a mitzvah physically without the body. So when you physically, let's say, Ozev Tazevime, the Baal Shem Tov says that if you see your body, even though it's Senacha, it supposes your divine service, don't ignore it. But when you transform something on a physical level, that in turn feeds and nourishes the soul. Because the soul cannot do a mitzvah in this world without a body.
Thank you.
Okay. And I'm sure there are other examples. Any other questions? So go to line 4 on page 425. So he says like this. Now that we've established that the kavana is down below Hashem Elokeinu, like he said, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu, is not the neshama as it is in its root, but down below. He says, V'kach yuvan gam kan v'omrei mika Hashem Elokeinu dafke. He's comparing the Hashem Elokeinu of mika Hashem Elokeinu Hamagbihi and Hamashpili liris to the Hashem Elokeinu that he said b'krishma, the 4th line at the beginning of the last paragraph of the previous page. So he says like that. Okay. Now what? That we'll also understand that Shayidei slapshus ha'atzmus the ein sof b'teira mitzvos v'ava v'yira lamata kamoy lamayla ba'atzmei mamash nikra v'aya l'keinu dafke kanal. That we're referring to the slapshus of Atzmus ein sof, whose kavana is safe Maaseh machshava Techila, to come down below and be mamshech alakus and the highest levels of the divine down below. When that manifests, b'teira mitzvos and aviyira lamata kamoy lamayla ba'atzmei, that's called havaya l'keinu dafke. So when we say mika Hashem Elokeinu, like he said earlier, that it's miyuchid to neshamas Yisrael, hamiyuchid to neshamas Yisrael. Who is like Hashem Elokeinu? We're not just talking about God's greatness, that he's beyond Hashem and Elokeinu, that is beyond higher and lower, that everything is one by him. We're talking about God's greatness that we can appreciate within existence. That down below, through our Torah and Mitzvos, through Alakus being drawn down, the Kavanah, Elyena is to come down and Tachtenim, and here we should experience it. That means Havaya Elokeinu. That means Mika Hashem Elokeinu. Who is like God? Like, there's nothing like God, Hashem Elokeinu, who has that ability to join together two completely paradoxical realities. Das Elyon and Das Tachten, Emek Reim, Emek Tachas, Hamagbihi and Hamashpili. The Im Chozer, and nevertheless, or notwithstanding, or nevertheless, Im Chozer, Hamagbihi l'sheves u'mashpili. So in other words, even when experiencing this oneness, there's still the element of Hamagbihi and Mashpili, because we're dealing with not annihilating the structure of existence, we're dealing with transforming it. And now he's going to explain what is this Hamagbihi and Mashpili. So here before we continue on, I want to just review the source of this. Everything we learned here about Hamagbihi and Mashpili was not really said in the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe, in the original Maimer. There, he spoke about Hamagbihi and Mashpili, primarily that Hamagbihi is the Allah that comes through mitzvahs. So if you go to Torah, if you want to look in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, but I think it's important to bring it back now into the discussion, and we'll see how the Mittler Rebbe enriches the whole topic in ways in the Alter Rebbe is very bekitzer. But once you read in the Mittler Rebbe, you come to really appreciate the idea. So the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, where he speaks about Hamagbihi, is 2 places. In the first Maimer, in the original Maimer, it's page 38 at the bottom of 38D, column 4, 38D, and then on top of 39A, where he concludes the Maimer, and then more at length at the end of the Maimer on page 4, or the beer of the Maimer on page 40A and B. So briefly, what he said there was that Hamagbihi is the elevation of Malchus, which is a Dalus, and you put the hey, which is less lamagam klum. Dalus means impoverished, like dal. The kimim offer dal. We're soon going to learn at the end of the Maimer, which is the hemshech of Hamagbihi l'sheves and Hamashpili liris. Kimim offer dal. He raises from dust those that are impoverished. So that's Hamagbihi is elevating malchus by turning it into a hey. The dalad by adding a yud, which is the yud of mitzvahs, the yud of tzedakah, like he said. From tzedek, you make tzedakah. Tzedakah today, Hamagbihi is b'chinas yud shebehei lamay lamay lebe'er ensof baruch mamash baruch hu mamash. So if you remember, we learned that by elevating this world, where does it reach? It doesn't just reach higher levels in Atzilus or even before the Tzimtzum. It reaches all the way to Etzem, because the whole kavanah of the Etzem, all of the machshava Techila, safe Maaseh, and mitzvahs reach that level, all the way in the Etzem. So Hamagbihi refers to, he says, l'shevet b'chnis mochel l'shift chosha. She says the hashira of elikus in a form of yeshiva. Lias melech le'elam, he says that is mitzvahs mamata l'mayla. That's through mitzvahs. And then he goes on and says, Torah, however, is the hamshachim l'mayla lamata, hamashpili lires, which we'll get to shortly. So in Torah, that's how he lays out these two levels. He doesn't discuss what we just learned about Yichud Elah and Yichud Tata. Because in Torah, everything is more bekitzer. But when you learn the Mitler Rebbe, you go back to the Alter Rebbe's Maimon, you could see it all come alive. Obviously, the Rebbe Rasha B'nayim Beis, though he doesn't speak in the language of Hamagbihi and Hamashpili, like I mentioned, but he does speak in the language of Yichud Elah and Yichud Tata. So the same idea, and I'm saying this very deliberately because this is going to help us understand the context of Ayin Beis. Because remember, Ayin Beis begins first with Halal Mamat Lamaila through Arimim Chalekai Hamelach, that is Mamat Lamaila through davening. Then he speaks Arimim Chalekai Hamelach Mamayla Lamata through Torah. And then he introduces mitzvahs into the picture, Ner Mitzvah. And as we said, a mitzvah is ultimately a combination of mamat lamayla, mamayla lamata. So all that's going to come together as we continue learning. That's why I wanted to just bring it all back. So the Rebbe, that Mitler Rebbe now is going to explain that this idea of reaching the etzem, where there's a total union and fusion between both deis, das elyon and das tachten, emek rem, emek tachlis, yichud elah, yichud tata. Nevertheless, there's Hamagbihi and Hamashpili. And he's going to explain now what that is. That now this Hagbah of Hashpola, however, is we're not talking now about creation, that the divine that the elevation of creation to exist. We're not talking about the process of creation. We're talking about the process of Aveda. So he says, Hagbah of Hashpola zu. When we say Hamagbihi and Hamashpili, we're talking Hakolhu be'inyan Torah mitzvahs v'ava v'yira. Everything we're discussing is in the context of doing Torah mitzvahs. No, as you could say, Hamashpili Lires is God, is Mamshech below, he descends below, he sends levels of Elikus to create existence. That's not the point here. The point here is the transformation of existence. That's what Hagbah of Hashpola. It's all in Torah mitzvahs and Ava Yir Bebirur, the Rapach, in the refinement or the clarity and the separation of the 288 sparks that are embedded and concealed in this world, that through our Aveda and Torah mitzvahs and Aviyida, we refine them, through the wisdom of Torah. And here he means Torah, I believe, in the general context, Torah and mitzvahs. The Torah dafke, but Chochma is bariru. What does Torah do? We come into a world on our own. We don't know without Torah. We don't know what's right, what's wrong, what path to travel on, what's to avoid, and what to embrace. What's a mitzvah? What's an aveda? What's permitted? What's not permitted? What's kosher? What's not kosher? What's pure? What's not pure? Comes Torah, the Chochma of Torah, which is the Chochma of Elikus, not the Chochma of Maaseh Bereishis, not the wisdom of how God, the design of existence, but we're talking about Chochma of the blueprint, the operator's manual, which is the Torah, to tell us how to use and transform existence. So Chochma the Torah, which is drawing, obviously it's coming all the way from the highest levels of Torah, that is bedidah, it clarifies. It clarifies the paths in this dark world, and that is the Hagbah of Hashpola that we're talking about is all within how we transform the material world into a dir b'tachtenim. So we'll soon get to the discussion, what is the Hagbah part and what's the Hashpala part. But overall, he's talking, it's all throughout the Aveda that we're doing. And now we'll continue from here. For who? The Chinis Yud de Magbi. If you recall, he said Yud is the level of Chochma. When he asked earlier, why doesn't it say Magbia and Mashpil? Why do we have a Yud at the end? So he said, I'm going back to page 423. He said the Yud is the Yud of Chochma HaKadesha. Chochma is always a Yud. Bina is a Hey. Because Bina is expansive. The Yud, the Nekuda of Chochma is usually referred to a Yud. Yeah. So he says, B'chinas ayin zen nikri Yud the Chochma de u'chmu l'gab ilas come down. Second, v'chol hakol. And yes, so what's the
423? We're on 423. Where were you reading from?
The first 7-8 lines. So he says, L'cheira yifla, why does it say Magbi with a Yud? Which is Lashon Nukva. Turns it into the feminine. Should have said a Magbi. So he said, Yud is Nechuda, the ayin, the Chochma, Shebekesa B'chlal. Shebekesa B'chlal, Shenichla Batel Ba'atzmis B'halah, the Chozer. Because we're talking about Chochma, that's completely bottled to Keser, to the Ratzon of Hashem. And that's the Pirush HaPasha, Magbi L'Shem, B'mkemei Atzmi. That through the Chochma, through the Yud, we're elevating and clarifying existence, how it should be aligned to what God wants. Mokim iti. L'kemei Atzmi. As it will be lost at Lavish and M'kemei Me'im Krim Yafia. So it'll be a level of that highest level of the divine. This is all the Yud. V'hu b'Yud the Chochma Gduma the Torah Hakdesha. I'm reading a little lower now. Shenikre Kisei Mishpat la'Atzmus Harem is the Ein Sof l'Sheves Allah. So who is the Keli for this? That's Chochma of Torah. Chochma of Torah is like an interface. Because on one hand, it's Chochma of Hashem and completely bottle, but on the other hand, it's like a Kisei. It's a way of God manifesting like a throne, which is the way the king rules. In this case, with Torah is giving us the rulings of what is right and what is wrong. And that's Magbi biyud shenikra nukva, b'chinas makabel, miyesh amiti. So this ayin of Chochma of Torah is the makabel. That's why it's Noshon Nekeva, from the yesh amiti. And that, in turn, clarifies and elevates the world to the way it's supposed to be, aligned to what Hashem wants. That's what the Torah does. Then he goes on to speak Hamashpili Lides, that's Das Tach. We'll get to that shortly. So going back to where we are right now. So that's what Torah does. Magbi. That's the Yud of Magbi. But then there's the Yud of Mashpili. Remember, the Yud of Mashpili, he said, is the Yud as it comes down in the divine into existence. Where initially it's like 2 levels. But then he said that the Yud of Magbi and the Yud of Mashpili are like 1. So the Yud initially of Mashpili is the Yud of Chochma of Maaseh Bereishis. That's how Chochma comes down, like he says at the bottom of page 423. So he says, the Chochma, the Maaseh Bereishis. But by the Eibishter, Magbi and Mashpil, both Yuds come as 1. Like we learned afterwards, like the Yud of Havaya and the Yud of Adnai. So now he says, that's Magbi. Then he comes and says, one second. Then comes the Yud of Mashpili, which is Yoshor. Because the Yud of Magbi is elevating, Chozer. You're elevating existence to be aligned to what God wants, through Torah, through Chochma. The Yud of Mashpili is Yoshor. Is drawing it down on the terms and relating to existence, as we learn. The B'chinis Yud, the Chochma, the Magbi, Zel Eila B'chinis Chozer, Mitera Mitzvos the Yisrael Lamato. The Yud of Chochma of Magbi, that's the Torah directing and guiding us, like the Oir, that's a siyua, that's helping the neshama down below. to direct and guide and illuminate the darkness of this world to know what's a mitzvah, what's an avera, what is asur, what is mutter, isser v'heter, kuma v'tada, and so on. That clarification. So that is Eila Magbia, elevating Memchinas Chozer, in a form of Chozer, because you're taking this dark world, a world where there's an animal soul, a world that is confused and a world that where you do not see openly what God wants, and you're elevating it to Chozer Mitera Mitzvos di Yisrael, from the Torah Mitzvos that the Jews do down below, Lamata, from their work, La'achar HaBirur. This comes after the Birur, the Chochma b'shem ma shemevar laban the negedavke. So in other words, what he's saying here is, and I have to read clearly to make sure I understand it, it sounds like he's saying that this comes after the Birur of Chochma d'shem ma, where shem ma, the bittul of Chochma, shemevar laban the negedavke. So is he saying that this is the Chozer that comes after the Yoshor of the Birur of Shem Ban through Shema? I'm not sure. So let's just read it and then we'll try to clarify. So he's saying, so this is Eile Chozer Lamato. L'achar HaBirur the Chochma b'Shema shemevar laban the negedavke kumei b'mitzvos maisius, like an actionable mitzvos. So what's the process? We're taking Tsemer Gashmi, like we learned, physical wool, or Klav Gashmi, physical hide, parchment. She'esim b'dvarim gashmim dafke. The mitzvahs that we do dafke with the physical matters. The noz tchilosim b'seifon, because as we said, the beginning is wedged in the end. The kavon is dafke and Maaseh b'poel lamato. The seif Maaseh ola lamailo. And the seif Maaseh, the action below, that's what elevates upward. Be'er chezer, be'ilui achad ilui, elevating one level after another level. To the highest levels, which most likely is indicating the level that's beyond higher and lower. That which is the concealment of all concealments, the less machshava tvisa beklal, a level what's completely beyond our thought being able to grasp. In other words, loy nitfas. You're talking about a level that's beyond our grasp. So all this seems to be talking about Chozer. He did mention la'achar HaBirur the Chochma b'shem ma, but I have to see what that means exactly. So that line is not so clear to me. But the general gist of it so far, he's been talking about Hamagbihi l'sheves, Hamagbihi, that even though we're talking about reaching the highest levels, but the process begins with a step-by-step process below that we elevate through Torah mitzvahs and Ava v'yira, through mitzvahs maisius, like he's saying, we're elevating the world to be aligned through the Chochma of Torah. The wisdom of Torah is telling us what mitzvahs to do to align existence and elevate it all the way to the source, all the way to this highest levels of in Atzmus.
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Let me just finish the topic. The question may be answered. So if you don't mind, let me just read a few more lines, because we're literally in the middle of a sentence. Okay. This is like what we learned earlier. The inyan tzedakah tereimim goy. Remember, we learned that tzedakah elevates reimim goy. That tzedakah elevates the goy, the nation. Shu klolos ha-mitzvahs shenikra b'shem tzedakah dafke. This is general.
Did you skip a line? Did you skip a line?
Not that I know of.
Yeah. You said the law must be machshav tfisa place called v'zel k'moshe mevor l'mayla be'inyan tzedakah. Oh, okay, maybe you did say it. I'm sorry. Okay.
So this is what we learned earlier about tzedakah tereimim goy, the tzedakah that elevates the goy, which is the theme that I just read from Torah, from the Alter Rebbe. That's why I'm connecting it. Shu klolos ha-mitzvahs, that we learned, this is the general concept of mitzvahs, is called nikra b'shem tzedakah dafka. It's called b'shem tzedakah because its process is an elevating process. Tereimim goy, k'may zedei tzedakahs, like we learned, the one that plants, that sows tzedakahs. That's referring not just to charity, literal charity, it's referring to all the mitzvahs. Sha'azriyah hein heich sodim de Yoshor, The zriya, what do we plant with mitzvahs? We learned that mitzvahs plant seeds, the seeds of the divine will in existence. That's the heich sodim of Yoshor shenimsha b'mitzvahs mamayla lamata b'bchina zriya. So Hashem, remember we said mitzvahs is a combination of mamayla lamata, mamat lamayla. So mitzvahs brings what seeds? It's not our own seeds. It's not like davening, which is completely generated and initiated from below. It's God is giving us erzaru al tzaddik. He's giving us mitzvahs, and He plants them into existence. Mamayla lamata b'china zriya la'erzaru l'tzaddik elyon canal. The erzarua, the sowed light that is planted for the tzaddik in this world, that's the mitzvah of Chozer. And then the second half of mitzvahs, once we have them planted in this world, where, for example, in wool, in physical world, God planted a seed called tzitzis. But now we have to actualize it. We have to bring it into action. So then comes the process of, after the planting, comes the ksira, which is with the harvesting. Lefi chesed, the ksira lefi chesed, b'teisvus bracha. Like we learned earlier, the chesed that we have from cutting and after as I said, the harvesting, with additional bracha, more than what was planted. So you plant the initial seeds, and now you get a teisvus bracha, additional blessings. So I wanted to just read the whole flow here. I'll stop here for any questions to explain that the process that we're talking about, Hamagbihi, is essentially the process of elevating the material world through mitzvahs all the way to the highest source. That's the purpose of it all. And once you're elevated to the highest source, you're fulfilling this purpose. So mitzvahs have both elements. I'm not sure yet how he connects it to, whether he's connected to Hamashpili. I don't think so. But right now, that's the process of Hamagbihi through mitzvahs. And Torah directs us what mitzvahs to do. Chochma of Torah directs us. So that's so far what he said. And again, he's going to talk more about it more in detail. But he's connecting it also to what we learned earlier about mitzvahs, when he spoke about ner mitzvah, that this is the process of what a mitzvah does in helping us transform the world. So let me stop here right before the parentheses for any questions.
So my question was, and I'm not trying to be, how shall we say, cute or clever here. There's a substantive point on the concept of deles machshav tfisus beklal. Essentially, we are trying to have our machshava to tofes bo, because the whole Inyan is a yichud of Shem Havai and Shem Hakima, and so the yichud of yichud tata with yichud ila, and essentially understanding das tachta and das elyon are essentially ultimately the same perspective, even if for us it may seem paradoxical, like the Aron and the Kodesh Kedoshim. Nevertheless, we are essentially trying to contemplate, to capture the essence of God by our thoughts and actions. No?
Well, we want to experience God on our terms or God on God's terms. If that's exactly the reason why I keep saying that most people are not on this level. Most of us are still trying to understand God on our terms, on a very basic level, fighting with our nefesh habamis and yetzar. You're correct if you're talking about in the beginning of Avodas Hashem. But those that have reached a level like Moshe Rabbeinu, where Hashem says, "Uponai lo yiro," you cannot see my face, come to a level where they're such bittul that for them to experience God, they are delighted and want to experience God on God's terms, because machshav, at the end of the day, the human mind can only grasp that much. And the goal is to experience God on God's terms. And that is even deeper than experiencing God on our terms. So yes, you can go and say, I want to understand everything. If you go with that approach, you'll understand godliness on your terms and so on. But that's why we have tools like Amunah, of Rusa Deliba, of Mesiras Nefesh. There's a whole seder of Aveda that it goes beyond our terms, that we elevate through step-by-step process. That's why I said you always begin with Aveda al Pitam Vadas, Mutfa, Murgish, Muskel. A child, you have to teach a child on a child's level. So if you're talking about a child, then obviously you're not up to yet these higher levels. Les machshava tfisa beklal is not the statement of negation, it's actually a statement of elevation. You're coming to a point of experiencing the divine that's beyond human thought. And you experience it in all kinds of ways. And that becomes something that you contain and you become one with.
Beautiful. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Or Zavrul Tzaddik Elyon, that's referring to Hashem?
No, referring to Zavrul Tzaddik, the Tzaddik below. Zavrul Tzaddik is the light, the divine light that's being planted in the mitzvahs that is given to a tzaddik. I mean here, a tzaddik meaning anyone that's doing tzedakah or doing mitzvahs. We learned it earlier. If you want to go back earlier, we learned it earlier on page 397. There he elaborated on this whole piece of tzedakah teremim goy zaruah tzaddik. If you look at page 397, there he discussed it at length. And furthermore, I would even go more than that and say, let me see something. Because it's so far back, probably most of you don't remember it. But when he started talking about mitzvahs at the bottom of piece 390, I would highly recommend that you go back and learn those pages, 390 through probably yeah. To 402, essentially 10, 12 pages that he discusses the whole idea of mitzvahs and tzedakah and everything we just learned. Here he's just referring to it briefly, but there it's elaborated upon at length how a mitzvah is a neshama, remember, on its own has its resource as a soul, but it doesn't have the power to really transform the world entirely without mitzvahs and Torah. So there he's coming to add what the mitzvahs help in elevating the world and transforming the animal soul. Because a mitzvah is Ratzon Hashem. So notice, think of a neshama trying to change this world without mitzvahs. It still can do a big job. It can educate the animal soul to think about God. But taking without a mitzvah, you don't have tzitzis, you don't have tefillin, you don't have Shabbos, you don't have the whole Taryag mitzvahs. So you really don't have a blueprint of how you transform the physical world into a dira b'tachtenim. That's the whole point where the Alter Rebbe says that's the nefesh halikis on its own is ner Hashem nishmas adam. Then ner mitzvah comes to add the planting of divine seeds. Think of mitzvahs as divine seeds embedded in existence with a mission the neshama come to find those seeds through doing mitzvahs. By taking wool and turning it into tzitzis. By taking hide and turning it into parchment for stam, for sefer Torah, tefillin, and mezuzahs. By taking money and turning it into tzedakah. By taking food and turning into the mitzvah of Einik Shabbos, pleasure on Shabbos. I mean, everything, the mitzvahs and everything they're transforming. That's the neshama now actively using mitzvahs. And then there's going to be, of course, Torah itself, Torah Oir, that gives us that pure picture of the etzem that's beyond any type of gradations altogether, which we'll learn about, and we have learned about already, Torah Oir. But that's the context here. So right now, he's going back to explaining how Hamashpili and first Magbihi is the level of mitzvahs, Chozer, taking the world, using Torah, the Chochma of Torah, to clarify what's a mitzvah, what's not a mitzvah, but even a mitzvah itself. What is kosher for, what wool is kosher for tzitzis? What's not kosher? What makes something proper, not proper? We're coming from Pesach. All the laws of Torah are all about clarifying how you align existence to God's will. And he's describing that, what he's saying here, that it has an element of mamayil lamata as the zriya, and then the ktsira is the ktsira, I said harvesting. It may be another word. Ktsira literally means to cut, but when you harvest the field, after you sow and plant and it's ready to be cut. There's another word for ktsira. I forgot what the word is. I don't know if it's harvest, because harvest, I think, maybe asifa. You know, you have Chag HaOsif, Chag HaKotzer, and Chag HaOviv. So
Iktsara, but Zor and the Dima Berina Iktsara. So that's the Dima, Zriya and Ktsiras.
But what would be the English word for Ktsira? I said harvest, because there's a stage where you sow and you plant, then you cut it, and then later you come and gather it. I think harvesting is gathering it. So maybe there's another word for Ktsira. To look up, there are three stages in all agricultural processes.
So
I mean,
when
literally
it
means
says,
to cut, but
right. So when it says Elyon, Tzaddik Elyon,
so go back to page 397. He explains it.
Reaping. You think you mean reaping?
Maybe reaping. Maybe reaping. Yeah, because you say right. You say Zayden bedima, we sow with tears, and Rina b'kseira, and we reap with joy. Reaping is probably the right word. Yeah.
All right, thank you. This was great. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm back with you. Sorry about that. Tzaddik Elyon, there's Tzaddik Elyon, Tzaddik Tachten, and he's referring here to Tzaddik Elyon, the higher level of a Tzaddik. I think on page 397 he may have talked about it. But either way, it's a rule. It's a rule. It's Tzaddik. Yeah, he says Tzaddik Elyon, Tzaddik Hashem Tzidkei Sover. Okay. Are there any other questions?
It's on 397. The bottom.
Yeah.
Hazarua l'tzadik elyon, Moshe Kastav ki tzadik Hashem tzedakos ahava. I don't know what that is. I know the pasuk. V'Moshe she'azriyahu bishval ksir v'tosefes bracha meruba.
Yeah. As I said, there elaborates the whole topic. Yeah. Are there any other questions? So essentially, just like when you plant a field, you sow a field, so you want more than what you've sowed. That's what you see. You plant the seeds, and then it grows into a whole harvest. Let's say a grain or any other seeds, and now you, as you said, reap. You reap, and you have a lot more than what you began with. That's the whole point. So this is Naved is the same thing. Hashem plants these seeds in this world. Every physical part of this world has seeds of mitzvahs in them. When we do a mitzvah, we're not just revealing the seed has now become a whole harvest. That's what he says, the Tosfos Brach. He elaborates that back on page 397 and on. That's what a mitzvah does. If you may recall, in Ayin Beis, much earlier, we learned about Gan Eden. That Gan Eden, God planted Gan Eden, had trees and had vegetation and plants and so on. When Adam and Chava came to the world, the garden was a full world. It had full of vegetation growing there. And yet, Vayenacheu began Eden, it says, La'ovdo l'shamra, to work and to protect, which we know is Mitzvos Saseh and Mitzvos Leisaseh. So what are Adam and Chava adding? The garden was a garden that was ready. He said clearly, Tosfos Bracha, to make the garden far greater than what they gotten originally. So we come into this world. The world is a beautiful world. It says the Eibishter created Vayara Lekim, the world, and he said Vayara Lekim Kitev. He saw it's a good world. It's a beautiful world that he created. But he wants the human being to make from beauty perfection, or from beauty even more beautiful. Not just quantitative, but also qualitative, and to transform the world. Because there are plenty of parts of the world that can either potentially be a jungle and a dark place. So that's number one. And even the beautiful places in this world, that's what a good gardener does. You take a beautiful garden and you make it much more beautiful. That's where the pasuk says, for example, Chassidus brings this often, where it says, Lases l'saken, kol ma shebara lases. Kol ma shebara lases. So Rashi says l'saken, that even though the world God created was already elam al miluya nivra, he created a perfect world, but then comes the l'saken that we make it even more perfect. And la'asid lave, it says it'll be a lot more beautiful than it was in Gan Eden. In Gan Eden the Shekhinah was below and it was a beautiful world. But then our Aveda is to take it to a whole other dimension and transform the entire existence. And what he says here, the reaping and then the harvesting of Elokus, that mitzvahs allow us to do. So mitzvahs are those seeds that he just described. But Mamai Lamata is the Heichsodim of Yoshor. And then come when you reap the chesed, the tesus bracha, the chesed that God also blesses us, that the reaping and the harvest should be successful with a lot more additional bracha than what we got that was there originally. And that's the Magbihi that he's talking about, the tzedakah teremim goy, elevating the goy of this world to that higher level. So there's much more to be said here, but I'm going to stop here. Now comes a parenthesis, which I see does not end. Okay, we're going to have to figure out where it ends. But I see in the parentheses, he elaborates a lot more on this concept of tzedakah. It could be just a one-line parentheses. Yeah, I'm almost sure it is. So I'll just read the parentheses. V'zeu kacham or chacham al zrei Esav. Lift them on your arms. Shetaremim legoyd and Hamashpili Yisrael. This is a
Kochem al zrei Esav.
Yeah, lift them up on your arms. That's shetaremim legoyd and Hamashpili Yisrael, to elevate the goy of Neshamas Yisrael. In other words, as they are a goy, as a nation among nations, to elevate them, but Atzmus ain't sof mamish. That means to lift them on your arms all the way to Atzmus ain't sof mamish. And this, I believe, was brought earlier in 396. Yeah. Yeah, Anechi Targalti Lafraim, Zre'esei. Yeah. If you look at 396, he talks about it. He elevates the child. He lifts him up on his arm. And he embraces him, kisses him. All with an echi of Primisa Kesser. Yeah, Tarach. You remember, like the father that lifts his child up to his face and embraces and enjoys and delights in him. That's, I think the parentheses ends at the end of the word Ein Sof Mamish. And I'm going to stop here because simply I think we have to read more than just another few lines. But he's going to go back to explain how this is Hamagbihi with the Yud of Magbihi. That's what the Mitzvah Rebbe is going to do. So I'm stopping here after the words Ein Sof Mamish, where I believe the parentheses ends. And any other questions?
Where can I learn? Sorry, where can I learn more about the Hey Chasadim of Or Yoshor?
Well, I'd begin with firstly, I would look in Sefer Lekutim of the Tzemach Tzedek. I don't have offhand in my mind right now a mimer that talks about it, even though there definitely are. It just doesn't come to mind.
But it seems like I guess I don't want to go into a whole sugya about this, but he kind of came out of, I don't want to say it came out of nowhere. He knows what he's talking about and I'm ignorant, but saying that.
Yeah, because this is common. And remember that Maimorim are, he writes things that doesn't necessarily explain, just says the facts. It's coming from those levels. So there are Maimorim that talk about it. I would simply go through the indexes. I don't have another way right now because I don't recall the exact mimer. For all I know, back on Shin Sadik Zayin, he may have mentioned it as well. Not sure. To look it up. Zerei Tzedakos. He may have mentioned it. And if not, I would begin with Sefer Lekutim, Tzemach Tzedek, or just do a search, as you usually do for these words, Hey Chasadim of Yoshor of Mitzvos. I know the topic and I can explain it, but I'll do that another time, maybe tomorrow, maybe the next class. Chesed is usually an Yoshor, because it's Amshocha. Gvura is usually a Chozer. Not like Eish. Like Chesed is Mayim, flows downward. So the Heich Sodim are the Heich Sodim of Chesed that cause everything to flow downward. So I think he does speak about it, if I recall earlier, about I'm just looking, he talks about Chesed for sure. Okay. And maybe they say, maybe they don't.
The top of page 400, at the end of the paragraph, he says, "L'kach kol ha-mitzvos shenasim chinas kelim rabim nikra tzedakah I don't know what the hey aleph is. Bechinas makabel dehay chasadim haklulim the ratzon ha'elyon shenimshach mitzar atzmo."
Yeah, there he mentioned it already, right?
What is the hey aleph?
Stucka behay. It's stucka not with a tzedek, but the letter hey.
Oh, I see. The hey. Okay. Got it.
It's essentially malchus on its own is less lamagam klum, has nothing of its own. But when you do a mitzvah, you're being mamshich the heich sodim into malchus.
Nice. Beautiful. Thank you.
Now, why dafke the heich? I mean, generally there's five sodim, there's heich sodim and hey gvuras. I think hey is probably the letter hey. That's probably the reason that he's mentioning it. Hey, as in tzedek, from tzedek to tzedakah, the hey, you're turning the dalet into a hey, so that's the heich sodim. I think that's why he mentions it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Most likely why. Yeah.
How are you
He
turning
may
the
talk
dalet?
about it. Yeah, I see later on the page, on page 425, he talks about the hay and the dalet. So he may actually address it more. We'll see.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Let me see. Actually, I see the next page as well. Interestingly. Talk about Lasheves. He didn't get to Lasheves. Then we have to talk about Hamashpili Lires. Okay, plenty more to go. So let's stop here. What?
Probably connected to Shabbos somehow.
What's connected to Shabbos?
Hamagbihi Shabbos. Maybe we elevate through Shabbos.
Listen, you can interpret what you like, but it's not what he says here.
Maybe he'll say it later. How do you turn the dalet into hay?
By putting a yud into it.
From tzedek to tzedakah?
By putting a yud of chochma, of bittul, and through mitzvos, you put the yud in the dalet, it turns it into a hay.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
We're going to learn about it. The dalet is dalus, like dal, or, and the hay adds a whole other dimension. I mentioned the Torah, he talks about it. Okay, let me stop here. We are closer to the bottom, 2/3 down the page, 200.